Hey guys, thank you for sharing your ideas and questions, also feedbacks. With last video, containerized application or otherwise Dockerization, I got few questions asking how we can write application for those containers. Because when we write web application, we have web server or application server or web container, whatever. So how we can manage all those to work together. More than that, when we spin out other container, let's say we have a web application with a Tomcat, and when we spin out other container, so how this both Tomcat servers work together. So I decided to have a few other one or two videos to give a full picture about those configuration. For example, how we can write application to web containers or Dockers, and how we can deploy those application. If you started this web development Java based web application maybe a few years ago, you may remember you created web application and you deployed this application on a web server or app server. Web server or app server, what's the difference? That is a common interview question, isn't it? If you participated to any interview, if you faced any interview for software engineer or senior software engineer, maybe associate, you may get this question: what is the difference between web server and application server? Okay, I can add other part to that. What are the difference between web server, web container, and application server? Now, little problem a little bigger. What is the difference between web server and web container? Let's make it this simple. So, web server is your old friend Apache server which run on port 80. You remember you deployed some PHP file, HTML file, or whatever the files, and you can run this, start this web server, and it start working. So, if you give a technical answer in your interview, it should be like this. So, web server is a server which handle HTTP request. Also, web server does not web server is not capable to handle any kind of Java EE specification in terms of Java. In terms of Java, web server does not have a capability to handle any Java EE specification. So, web container is the next step. What web container does is, web container is capable to handle part of Java EE specification. What is that part? Is servlet. Web containers are capable to handle servlet, which is a part of Java EE specification. And application server or otherwise app servers are capable to handle full spectrum of Java EE specification. There are other answers, like you can say web servers only handle HTTP requests, and application servers handle more than that, like RMI calls and so far so on. But this is not a video to discuss about what is application server and what is a web server. But I am going to tell you is, if you used to write any Java application, web application, you may use this web server and app server. So now, when you are using those containers, or let's say let's have a common word called containers. When you port your web application on a container, right? So this container can handle more than one application. So if you have a 10 application which run on a single container, let's assume JBoss server or WebLogic or whatever server, then if your one application has some problem, if you need to restart, then all other 9 applications will go offline. So we are writing business critical, high available application, right? So it is not fair to restart those applications just because we got problem with other applications which share the same web container. And second problem, nowadays we deploy our application on cloud. So when you deploy in the cloud, most of the time you don't have a luxury to restart your web container. So now also, if you are sharing, like if you're using different configuration on different web application what you're using, so that would not easy. I'm not saying it is not possible, that is not easy to maintain those, because if two different applications need two different versions of the same configuration, that is little hard to configure. So now as a solution, developers came up with the concept called containerless application. What is containerless application? Okay, if you have a container and if you porting your web application on that container, so you have to restart the container in case of some configuration, apply some configuration or something. But how about this? You embed your web server or container to your application. So when you run your web application, it will start a container and it will work on top of that container. So that means your application will come up with its own container. So you can do whatever you want to that container, because it's sole depend and sole dedicated to that application, right? Its whole purpose of living is to give a container to this own application. So now what are the advantages? We can do restart, we can have own configuration because it's owned by us, owned by our application. So more than that, you will get your most loved public static void main method. Okay, so if you happen to be a Java programmer who use console application, who develop console application or Swing application, so you remember, right, public static void main, which is a very starting method what we learned and what we used. But ever since you start to develop web application, you could use this lovely method. So now when you're using this containerized application, because you are developing, you are writing, you are implementing just a Java application, right? So only thing is you are embedding your server into that. So when you run your application, that application will create a container and work on that container. How we can do this? That is the next question. There are multiple ways. There are a lot of frameworks out there. So I'm not going to use all those frameworks. You can go and search, like especially if you search a microservice application, microservice framework, so you can get those frameworks. You have a Springboard, you have a Drop Wizard, you have a Spark. We have a many things, right? I'm not going to name everything, but I'm going to talk about few leading frameworks. I'm going to show you how you can write containerless application in a few minutes using Springboard today, right? And I'm going to use one or two other frameworks in a different videos, and later I will show you how we can port or how we can deploy those servers on those applications on Docker. Why I choose Springboard? Because Springboard is one of leading framework out there, which has a very good performance, very good memory footprint, and very good process usage and everything. If you go through some stats or some performance benchmark over the internet, so you can find Springboard's doing very well, especially latest versions. And also it is comes with your favorite dependency injection frameworks and everything, right? So how those frameworks works? It has its own HTTP server, its own REST API, REST implementation framework, and other utilities. If you take Springboard, so it comes with the Spring and Apache. And if you take Drop Wizard, it comes with a Jersey as a REST API framework and Jetty as HTTP server. And it comes with the Jackson and other utility libraries as well. So everything is inbuilt. You don't have to do anything. You just need to focus on implementing your business logic. But keep in mind, you need good with these REST verbs like controllers, services, this kind of a REST architecture. That's it. So let's go and learn about how we can write application using Springboard for this video, and I'll do other video for maybe Drop Wizard or some other framework. So now I'm going to show you how we can practically create a Springboard application as a containerless application in other words, container embedded into application. So I'm going to use IntelliJ IDEA for my as my tool. So IDE. So I'm going to use a Maven, and to make life easy, I'm going to use Maven quick starter archetype, right? And I'm using 1.8. So next group ID is com.krishanta. So artifact ID Spring Boot demo, right? So I'm going to use version unchanged and bundle with Maven. So this is my Maven setting. So Spring Boot demo. So I'm not going to change the location where the project is going to save, right? So finish. Okay, so now you have a standard project architecture. So you can see it's a main this app and main Java, src main Java and src test Java. So standard Maven convention. So now what we need to do is we need to add dependencies to our project, right? So if you check, the latest version is 1.4.2. I'm going to use this release version. So what we can do is we can add, there are multiple ways to do this, but I'll go show you first way, right? Parent group ID is org.springframework.boot, right? And artifact ID is Spring Boot starter parent, right? Spring Boot starter parent. And version is, I'm going to use 1.4.2. keep in mind, Spring naming convention, you have to add the release. 1.4.2 release. So that's how Spring naming convention goes, right? So now we have added parent, right? So you know what parent does is, right, in a Spring, in a Maven. And I'm going to add my Spring Boot dependency. You can use like this is just IDE feature. You can use type DEP and use tab, so it will work, right? So it's asking my artifact ID first. You can go with always group ID and the artifact ID, but I'm going to give the artifact ID first. Spring Boot starter web. So that is my artifact, right? So group ID org dot spring framework dot boot, right? So you don't need to specify the version here, because Maven parent will automatically set this version to 1.4.2, right? So we are good. So we added all dependencies, right? Now this is my favor. I'm usually don't like this app class. So what I'm going to do is I'm first deleting tests and then delete. So I don't want to use any auto created classes. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use application class, right? And public static void main, usual lovely method, right? So now we need to convert this as Spring Boot application. So how you can do it is you can use Springboard application, right? So when you add the Springboard application, so now from here onwards it's automatically act as Springboard application, right? So here what we can do is, right, we kick off because this is the main method, right? You know, when we start web application, so this is the first method it getting called, right? So now what we can do is Spring application dot run, right? So it's asking what is my class, so application dot class, and I'm going to pass this args. Okay, so now we're pretty much done, but only thing is we didn't set up anything to take incoming request. So I'm going with the standard convention, right? So new, I'm going to use a package to put all my controllers in a controller package, right? So here I'm going to use something called creating controller. Okay, so now this will act as controller. We need to configure this as a controller. REST controller annotation. So with the REST controller annotation, it will consider as a controller. So now we need to add a method, public string greeting, return. So I'm going to use as a formatted text. Okay, so we're done, right? So now we need to configure this as a request mapping. So I'm not going to explain those in detail because I hope you know those things, right? Those are standard REST specification and REST development. If you ever used to develop any web application, you know this stuff, right? So now I'm pretty much okay. So now earlier days, what you had to do is you had to compile this, create a WAR file or R file, and deploy into the Tomcat server, right? So you have seen nothing we configured as a server. We didn't use any Tomcat or anything. So now I'm going to go to here. This is my main method. So I'm going to run my main method. Okay. So you can see now, if you check this console, spring loaded 1.4.2, which is the version we configured, right? So it will start the servers. Okay, so no errors, right? Server started on a port 8080. So now what we can do is we can go and check HTTP localhost 8080. Here you go, right? From nothing, we implemented working web application within few minutes, right? So now you can understand, right? So you can do any HTML formatting here, right? Whatever you want, right? Changing colors, anything. Not only the HTML, right? So if you familiar with standard web application, so you can add service and model, right? If you used to use any Spring MVC, right? Service model classes, and you can create Spring web application. It's very easy. So now I need to draw your attention for few things. Like this is like magical. You written a few codes, but it's end of those few lines, it's a working web application. How and what's happened behind the scene? So actually what happens is we use standard initialization. So with Maven we use a few libraries, right? So you can see we used Spring Starter Kit. So and from application we call this run method, right? So if you go to run method, so you can see right how this method is implemented and everything, right? What you can do is, if you want, like, you can put this application to debug mode, right? So there is nothing especially you should do to debug. It's not like you create a remote debugging or something, right? So you just can right click and go into debug application, right? So it will debug as your standard Java application. It's really easy. So other thing, the Spring is fully open source project. Springboard is a fully open source project, so you can go to GitHub and you can see the code. It's nothing magical, nothing behind the scene, nothing happening, right? So you can go and check the code, or else what you can do is you can use IDE like this, and you can debug the code like this, right? So you can see this is IDE feature, right? So you can go to Spring code and you can see when you call run what exactly happening over here, right? So if you go inside, what exactly happening, right? So it called this one, and like that you can keep going. Other thing, as I mentioned, Spring is open source project, so there's a community, so you can contribute if you want, or you can go and see the code. Is nothing hidden and nothing magical. Other thing, right? Like, you can feel like, okay, how I can write a production application like this starter kit? You don't have to. So what you can do is, right, so you can there are a few initializers, but this is something one of my favorite, start.spring.io, right? So you can give your package name here, and you can say like Spring Boot demo, right? So you can define whether what's a Maven or Gradle, whatever, and Maven version. And if you have some dependencies, like if you need to go with other dependencies, you can set those, or if you don't know what you're looking for, you can go with full version, right? And you can select whatever the you need to incorporate: Spring Security, Spring AOP, and Spring Web, and JDBC, Velocity, FreeMarker, whatever, right? So anything whatever the dependencies you need, right? Cloud application. So you can, maybe, let's see, with the AWS there, right? Okay, that's not there. So like that, then you can generate project and you can download as a zip file, right? And you can use that, right? You don't have to stick to Spring starter kit, but what I'm saying, like, you have multiple initializers, and if you need, you can use there is other tool, Spring initializing, like command line tool. You can use those as well, right? So now I think you have good idea. So this is what you need to learn. Springboard is come with everything, but you can add whatever the packages you want, and you can define the project the way you want, right? It's really easy.